Facing the Dragon, Confronting Personal and Spiritual Grandiosity. Chapter 1. The Lucifer Complex and the Enemy Within. Psychological Reflections on Human Evil. Thomas Brunner, 2000, recently compared my work with that of Thomas More and characterized it as follows. While Thomas More's books may be sifted down into the maxim, the sacred is closer than you think, Robert Moore's books exhibit the central idea that the demonic is closer than you think. This distinction misses some of the subtleties of my understanding of the important connection between the sacred and the evil, but it does accurately characterize the urgency of my concern that we as individuals, groups, political and cultural tribes, and as a species, quickly come to a more adequate dynamic understanding of the great solar fires that operate unconsciously within us to drive the increasing epidemics of personal and social evil. Why do I emphasize the dynamics of human evil in my research and teaching in psychology and spirituality? Because any approach to spirituality that hopes to confront the personal and communal destructiveness threatening the human future must avoid several traps. First, we must avoid the New Age tendency to deny the reality and power of evil. This widespread flight into the light is particularly tempting today because it requires so little in the way of either reflection or action. It enables continued denial of the seriousness of the situation and denial of how we as individuals participate in our own destruction and the destruction of our communities and planet. Second, we must avoid the historically popular tendency to find a human other to serve as a scapegoat for explanation of the impact of evil in our lives. One who can serve as a receptacle for our shadow projections and who, if they are imprisoned, tortured, burned, bombed, and so forth, can be used as ritual sacrificial victims to give us a bogus sense of mastery over our desperate situation. These misguided strategies were ably discussed by Ernest Becker in Escape from Hell, 1985, and The Denial of Death, 1975. Racism, classism, anti-Semitism, religious bigotry, and other misguided tribalisms have majored in this seductive but demonic attempt to locate and suppress or destroy the toxins that afflict us. Sexism has been a historic and even more ubiquitous strategy for finding a scapegoat. Both men and women must share the responsibility for starting to break the historic pattern of blaming the other gender for other destructiveness and evil. As some feminist theories have pointed out, the different genders may experience different patterns of temptation or vulnerability to various forms of sin or evil, but neither one should continue to explain evil by reference to gender. Both genders and persons of all classes, races, religions, and sexual preferences participate in the experience of evil, and all are responsible for its perpetuation. All must respond to the challenge of coming to an understanding of evil that is neither naive nor grounded in scapegoating of the other, but which may account for some of the forces of destructiveness that threaten to destroy us. What are the marks of human evil? Being able to talk with any authority about evil is not one of the strengths of modern flatland secular culture. Take, for example, the case of the Holocaust. Witness how difficult we have found it to face our tendency to split off our consciousness of the Holocaust to avoid looking at it, and to let our denial of the reality and power of its evil overwhelm us either by minimizing or trivializing the significance of the war against the Jews. Responses range from absolving the Germans of their responsibility for the Holocaust to forcing the German people to carry the collective shadow for the whole human species. We hate to admit the fact that the genocidal impulse is species-wide. Even Hannah Arendt's emphasis on the banality of evil in the Holocaust experience has made it easier for us to engage in massive denial of the power and pervasiveness of radical evil in human experience. Modern theologians have, for the most part, been little help. Recent theology tends to discuss theodicy. Can God be a good God, given the manifest evil in the world? Long discussions usually focus on the nature and limits of the power of God and whether or not God wills evil or merely permits it, willingly or unwillingly. Thousands of pages elucidate the various perspectives one might take on such issues. Scholars with a philosophical bent may find some of these discussions interesting and provocative, but they tend not to be, as we say today, experience near. They seem rather to treat evil as if it were merely an interesting academic issue for discussion in graduate-level seminars. This is a classic way of responding to evil by those who have not achieved an adequate warrior initiation. Footnote 2. Contemporary philosophers and theologians differ from the shamans of tribal culture in their lack of maturation in the warrior line of psychological and spiritual development. In contrast to our modern clergy and psychotherapists, not to speak of our professors, the great tribal shamans knew that their roles as healers and spiritual leaders required them to be warriors as well. Tribal peoples also treated these issues in a sophisticated way in their mythologies. While we obviously need to get beyond the limitations of tribal perspectives, we also need to ask if there is not significant wisdom for us in the ancient narrative traditions about evil. Tribal people saw careful thinking about the nature and dynamics of evil as a serious practical matter, essential to personal and communal existence, and critical to the survival of the human community. I do not share the view of many scholars today who ascribe this interest to primitive superstition or to the effects of socio-political structures of domination. Contemporary scholarly dismissals of pre-modern tribal wisdom on these issues are as arrogant, grandiose, and inflated as they are ambiguous. Contemporary theologians are, for the most part, no more appreciative of these traditions from folklore and mythology than the secular, reductionistic, social, and behavioral scientists. Long before a few contemporary theologians began to rediscover the centrality of mythic narratives in articulating spiritual truth, tribal peoples had spent thousands of years perfecting mythic narrative and storytelling as ways to provide in-depth understanding of the nature and dynamics of the human experience of evil. I agree with Carl Jung that we must return to mine this ancient wisdom of the human mythic imagination if we are to regain an adequate capacity to discern and confront the presence and power of human evil today. Evil in folklore and mythology. From an extensive comparative study of ancient wisdom traditions, I have distilled the following list of assumptions that they held about the nature and dynamics of evil. 1. Evil is a reality with an agency of its own. 2. The presence of evil can be felt in the enchanting power of denial on individual, familial, cultural levels, and seductive power of what the philosopher and theologian Paul Tillich called dreaming innocence. 3. The chief tactic of evil is to present the human individual and community with a false, deceptive representation of reality. In short, it lies. 4. Evil, therefore, has the capacity to clothe and disguise itself in forms that seem innocent, good, or at least justified, and have a seductive attractiveness. 5. Being near this evil enchantment causes you to lose your powers of discernment and vigilance, and your spiritual and moral light grows dim. Its influence is contagious. Tribal peoples around the world recognized this danger and built elaborate systems of taboo and ritual insulation against it. 6. An evil presence can get inside your community, family, home, and body, and even into your psyche before you even realize the danger exists. It is already in the house by the time you realize you have a problem. 7. Once inside, evil begins to erode the foundations of personal and social life by presenting itself as a true center of life. It functions as a black hole, a powerful vortex that in effect attacks being itself. This is the human reality behind the biblical injunction against idolatry. You shall have no other gods before me. We can read it this way. You shall not create bogus or pseudo-centers for your life and society. 8. Evil multiplies itself on your energy, your lifeblood, your creativity. It co-opts your good and often magnificent energies and potentials and makes them serve hatred, sadism, oppression, and the destruction of health and life. It recruits and diverts the energies of life and creativity into the service of death. 9. Evil denies the reality of death and all human limitations. It makes an insatiable, limitless quest the substitute for a legitimate expansion of the individual self. It puts polymorphous desires and pleasures in place of a social concern for community and the consequences of one's actions. It infects us with what Kierkegaard called the sickness of infinitude. 10. The presence of evil can be seen in its effects on the persons and community around it. It is not simply an idea or an absence of some positive quality. It is an active, aggressive, anti-life force that attacks the health and vitality of everyone around it. You shall know them by their fruits. These insights caused many cultures to describe the phenomenology of evil with mythic images of a vampire that thrives on the absence of light. See Shanahan, 1994. You are most vulnerable to it when you are the most disconnected from your relationships and trying to cope with your life and problems alone. It manifests great intelligence as if it has lived many lifetimes and has methodically developed a capacity to detect and exploit personal weaknesses and blind spots. It preys in a seductive way on your rightful need for attention and recognition that is not itself demonic. It captures your love and turns it into necrophilia. It captures your legitimate assertiveness and turns it into sadism. It captures your knowledge and turns it uses it for deception, greed, and antisocial manipulation. It captures your desire to nurture and turns it into domination and oppression. In contemporary culture, even when many theologians have become lost in their own enchanted innocence, the intuitive understanding of evil expresses itself in an extraordinary way in such movies as Invasion of the Body Snatchers, The Exorcist, Cape Fear, the Alien series, Looking for Mr. Goodbar, The Andromeda Strain, Silkwood, and many others. Consider, for example, the recent remake of John Carpenter of the science fiction classic The Thing, 1982, starring Kurt Russell. In an isolated Arctic outpost, some scientists discover a spaceship in the ice. The wreck has been buried for centuries. Lying dormant in the wreckage is an alien creature with the capacity to change forms, invade, and attach in a parasitical way to other life forms to increase its size and strength while destroying the individuality of those life forms it co-ops and colonizes. The first group of scientists to discover the wreckage are naive about the potential risks to themselves and do not take proper precautions. Their research colony is contaminated by the alien, and though they fight back, all except one man are killed by the alien. When the movie begins, we see a dog approaching our camp, being chased across the tundra and fired upon by a man in a helicopter. The dog runs into the camp and mixes with our dogs. The man in the helicopter lands, shouts in a seemingly berserk way, and continues to fire until others respond by shooting and killing him. Only much later do we learn that the alien had infected the dog, and the man was trying to kill the dog to prevent the infection of spreading. People did not understand this mission, so he was killed instead. As the movie progresses, one individual after another is contaminated by contagion with the Thing, and their naivety about its presence makes it impossible for them to protect themselves. The shaman warrior consciousness finally manifests in Kurt Russell's character, who does the investigation necessary to discover the reality of the radical danger posed by the intruder. He is horrified to find that the alien is already in the camp and has found a way to invade the human body without being seen. Only a blood testing by fire can determine the presence of the infection. As the contagion in the camp spreads, the various sources of heat and light are gradually destroyed. The shamanic warrior figure realizes that the Thing must be contained at any cost, including his own life. At the end of the movie, he faces the horror of the Thing, with only his steely resolve and fire as a weapon. The audience gets a sense of the incredible magnitude of the power and malignant agency of the power of evil that infected the human community. Though we are shaken by the power, resourcefulness, and focused intentionality of the demonic presence, we still admire the valiant courage of the human response once the radical nature of the situation was discerned. While the movie picks up the ancient themes of invasion and contagion by evil, its ending reflects the contemporary tendency toward hopelessness about the power of evil. This probably explains why we prefer to deny evil rather than to face it, because we see little possibility of overcoming it. This underscores my point that folklore and mythology contain the deepest, wisest, and most sustained reflections we have on evil, about what we do about it and what we do about it. And what to do about it. In contrast to recent, more shallow understandings of evil as merely a willful choosing to act destructively, tribal cultures were clear about the radical reality, power, and ego-alien agency of evil. They had a deep sense of evil as possession, as having a cause or agency beyond the conscious ego, one that seduces individuals into states of enchantment that compromise their ability to liberate themselves or even realize the destructiveness of their behavior. Even more importantly, the myths of tribal cultures also saw the human potential for discerning, understanding, confronting, and liberating the human community from possession by evil. Liberation, usually seen as a form of exorcism, required consultation with the shaman or sorcerer and an appeal to the concern that action of the wider community. Powers beyond the individual person and family had to be brought to bear on the toxic, enchanting influences until the individual could be restored to normal human functioning. In short, traditional societies spent far more time trying to understand and combat evil than does contemporary society. Modern culture has managed to make itself so blind to the reality of evil that it has become almost incapable of discerning the magnitude of its threat to the human future. How else can we explain the pervasive denial of evil that dominates our time? By turning away from the resources of the mythic imagination, we have stripped ourselves of the capacity to cut through our denial of the destructive forces that we face. Resources from psychoanalytic reflection. But wait, are we not simply romanticizing and mystifying tribal cultures? Is there any contemporary evidence to support the idea that the engines of radical evil come from outside the human ego? That evil is really a possession and enchantment of the human self, and not simply a misguided conscious act of an otherwise perfectly rational and intact human ego? Has psychoanalysis, for instance, discovered anything remotely resembling the traditional views of evil? Viewed cross-culturally, the traditional views support the existence of what we might call a Lucifer complex that threatens to seduce and possess the human ego consciousness. In some cultures, this toxic alien presence is conceptualized as demons, in others as idolatry, in others as the power of the temptations of illusion and desire. This presence usually promises both significance and satisfaction of desire, the eclipse of limitations, and the ability to become the center of the world. Its final outcome is almost universally recognized as hubris, madness, and a resulting destruction of the human community and human life. Several different schools of psychoanalysis have indeed provided concepts and compelling clinical evidence of reappropriating the traditional views of evil with renewed respect and appreciation. Not only have they discovered evidence of such a reality, but they have provided unprecedented revolutionary ways to understand the widespread nature of this phenomenon in human life. That it is not only a tribal reality, but a human species-wide reality. Contemporary psychoanalytic studies of the nature and dynamics of narcissism studies of the nature and directions of the narcissism relate directly to the traditional understandings of the dynamics of human evil. Heinz Kohut and the psychoanalytic self-psychologists were not the first to discover the destructive results of pathological infantile grandiosity. A careful scrutiny of various schools of psychoanalytic psychology reveals general belief in the presence in the human psyche of what I call the great self within, a very real inner presence that is not the same as a healthy human self or ego, but can take possession of an ego and drive it to fragmentation and total destruction. This great self within, also called the God complex or the God imago, has sometimes been equated with Satan or the devil, but it is much more complex than the imago of Satan. It is not evil in itself, even though it does fuel the Luciferian tendency. Later chapters will discuss how unconscious identification with this inner reality can lead both into possession states and splitting of the human psyche. Here, we will tour the history of psychoanalysis for clues to the reality of the great self within. Depth psychologists from Freud to Kohut observed a tendency for the human ego to be overwhelmed by grandiose godlike claims grounded in psychological systems beyond the awareness of the ego. Freud on the id and superego. In the classical psychoanalysis of Sigmund Freud, the great self within was not perceived with the clarity about its structural cohesiveness that is possible today. Nevertheless, Freud did note and posit structures in the unconscious that manifest phenomena that I believe are generated by the same reality. Freud's structural theory described two powerful inner realities that manifested godlike claims in different ways, the id and the superego. The id, or the it, was the driving force behind totalistic instinctual drives for sex and aggression, the insatiable appetites of the pleasure principle and archaic desire. One could say that the appetites of the id are larger than human, godlike in their totalistic and grandiose claims. The archaic superego, on the other hand, is not grandiose in its desire for instinctual discharge, but in its total perfectionist demand for compliance with the highest ideals and standards. Although Freud did not conceptualize these two systems together as comprising a great self within, he did describe phenomena reflecting something within the self that makes grandiose godlike claims on the individual, often leading to illness and worse if not properly confronted and regulated. Freud, therefore, was the first scientific psychological researcher to identify powerful, grandiose forces in the psyche that the conscious ego must learn to recognize and relate to in a positive and effective way if life is to be served. Alfred Adler on the superiority complex. Alfred Adler's thought highlights the reality of the great self within more clearly than does Freud's. In Adler's view, all psychopathology, including the experience of the inferiority complex, results from a usually hidden superiority complex that is not available to the consciousness of the individual. This unacknowledged claim to superiority leads the individual to feel entitled and exempt from the limits and claims of human existence, and subsequently to engage in a variety of dysfunctional and abusive behaviors. While Adler was more of a phenomenological psychologist who did not emphasize deep structures in the psyche, it is striking that he founded his theories on the idea that human destructiveness results from an unacknowledged, unconscious psychological orientation with an antisocial claim to superiority, and that a psychological cure requires disidentification from this grandiose attitude. Carl Jung on the archetypal self. Carl Jung has given us the clearest delineation of the great self within. Jung not only affirmed the existence of such an archetypal self beyond the ego, but unlike many of his more naive and romantic followers, he wanted us to take great care lest this archetypal self overwhelm the ego with its grandiose energies. We must carefully distinguish Jung's position on this issue from those of some of his successors. Many who call themselves archetypal psychologists do not retain Jung's concept of the archetypal self, but represent a so-called deconstructionist position in psychology. Even though they focus on images and the imagination, they do not offer a coherent theory of psychological deep structures that ground the imagination or articulate an understanding of any transegoic great self rooted in the collective unconscious. My own research has convinced me that Jung was correct in his formulations, and that he can help us understand how the engines of human evil are grounded in the reality and power of an archetypal great self within. How, then, does this inner reality relate to evil? Cultures around the world taught that the great engine of evil was arrogance or hubris, as the Greeks called it. Tribal cultures often thought that the movement into arrogance resulted from the possession by a god or demon. Psychoanalytic research has helped us understand how deeply insightful these early cultures were. But it has also helped us go beyond them in understanding the results of possession by these grandiose energies. We now know that the psyche splits and cannot maintain its structural integrity when it cannot relate to these divine energies in a conscious and constructive way. Facing the dragon. Throughout human history, spiritual masters and sages have utilized various mythological images to symbolize the presence and power of the grandiose energies they intuited to be present in the depths of the human psyche. My own research has found no mythic image for these energies used more often than that of the dragon. World mythology presents the dragon with two different faces: the dragon as enemy, and the dragon as a source of power and blessing. Western spiritual traditions have tended to emphasize the interpretation of the dragon as enemy, the nemesis of human life, a tradition best exemplified by the classic Beowulf. The task was to slay the great beast, called by many names, including Behemoth and Leviathan. Human life and civilization somehow depended on the success of the dragon slayer. The other tradition is more characteristic of Eastern spiritual traditions. Both Christian and non-Christian. Here, the dragon, including the great self within, is not demonized, but seen rather as a beneficent resource to be related to consciously for its transformative regenerative energies. The lectures presented in the following chapters address the human concerns reflected in the Beowulf traditions. The necessity for vigilance, this is in discerning the dragon's presence, and the dragon's threat to personal, social, and spiritual life when one encounters it. Unprepared. Lack of a sophisticated consciousness of the dragon within leaves us defenseless against the evil effects of its invasion into our personal and social lives. Any realistic hope for a promising personal or planetary future requires us, like Beowulf, to wake up and face the dragon of personal and spiritual grandiosity.